The innovation of aircraft in the mid-20th century and the aerial arms race of the Second World War gave us a host of beautiful and fascinating aircraft. The dawn of the jet transformed flight completely, and the first of these cutting-edge aircraft that many nations around the world had access to was the de Havilland Vampire. De Havilland was an aircraft company formed in 1920 by Geoffrey de Havilland. During the interwar years, they built a number of different aircraft types, like the popular Moth biplane and the Albatross airliner. Into the Second World War, they designed and built the famous and incredibly effective Mosquito, a twin-engined fast bomber that I really must one day do a documentary on. While the Mosquito was becoming the embarrassing bane of Nazi Germany, both Britain and Germany were working on a new type of aircraft that would be faster altogether. The idea of using a gas turbine jet engine to power an aircraft had actually been concepted long before the Second World War. The first working jet engine was designed by Frank Whittle, and it was all the way back in 1929 that he submitted his design to the Air Ministry. Whittle was not aware of at least some of the previous work done on gas turbine engines, and the Air Ministry wasn't particularly interested in his design at the time, so he continued to work on it, attempting to get a prototype constructed in 1930. He approached a steam turbine factory, but the costs involved in developing the prototype were too great to take the risk, especially as they were not an aircraft company. 5 years later, in 1935, Whittle approached the same company armed with the financial backing of investors interested in the engine's potential. He managed to persuade them to build a prototype, which became the first jet engine to run in 1937. Testing continued, running the engine at length to pick apart its endurance capabilities and pitfalls. It was not destined to be the first jet engine to fly, however, as in Germany, a man named Hans Joachim Pabst von Arhain had, separately, come up with his own jet engine design and approached the aircraft designer Ernst Haeckel. They built the Heinkel HE-178, and in 1939 it became the first turbojet aircraft to fly under its own power. That same year, the Air Ministry in Britain commissioned an aircraft powered by the new engine, and the prototype airframe was built by the Gloucester Aircraft Company. The Gloucester Whittle, as it was known, flew in May 1941 for the first time. This would later be developed into a very different twin-engined jet aircraft, the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's first operational jet aircraft. At the time of the Whittle test, the Air Ministry had commissioned de Havilland to design a new aircraft and its engine. Earlier that year, and 6 days later than the first, there was a second test flight of the Whittle with several notable guests, including Geoffrey de Havilland himself, his chief engineer, and his chief engine designer, Frank Halford. Halford had been associated with Whittle's original project, and soon got to work designing the engine that would power de Havilland's jet fighter. Progress on the new engine was fast. It was designed, tested, tuned, and ready for flight tests as early as 1942, but unfortunately the airframe was not yet ready. De Havilland had been instructed to continue to focus on the production of the Mosquito, given its importance to the war effort, so the airframe was lagging behind the development of the engine. In early 1943, flight tests for the engine began after it was installed into the Gloucester Meteor prototype. The airframe for the Vampire would have a rather peculiar trait. By this time in the war, most cutting-edge fighter planes were of an all-metal construction, but de Havilland had used a trick they had learned with the Albatross airliner to make their airframe out of wood. They built moulded plywood shells that would be stuck together to make a monocoque wooden fuselage. Not only did this save on weight, It also made the aircraft much more aerodynamic, not having the need for the bolts and rivets of a metal design. This technique had been used on the Mosquito, giving it a strong yet lightweight construction that helped it reach speeds that could outpace German fighters. The Vampire would have a composite construction, with its airframe being made of both metal and wood. The wooden part would be most of the central fuselage, encompassing the nose and cockpit, all the way up to bulkhead 4 where the engine was placed. Metal was used around the engine, the wings, and the twin booms and tailplane. The reduction in weight gained by the use of wood in the forward part of the fuselage wasn't the only advantage. The wooden structure around the cockpit also conserved warmth. This would be of particular advantage as Vampire marks were able to go higher and higher, which is something we'll get onto a little bit later. One of the most notable and striking characteristics of this plane is the twin boom tail design. Not a particularly popular way to design an aircraft, but de Havilland chose to build the Vampire this way for a few reasons. Firstly, it would simplify any airframe design changes that had to be made with any engine changes, and as the jet was a new design that could see a number of fast improvements to its efficiency and thrust, simplifying the changes made when such updates came through was probably quite wise. It also helped with the simplicity of the air intake design and helped shorten the overall tailplane length, reducing friction on the aircraft. By August 1943, the airframe design was ready for testing and the first prototype, named Spidercrab LZ548/G, was ready for flight. After taxiing trials and a couple of very short liftoffs, the first proper maiden flight was undertaken by Geoffrey de Havilland's son and the company's chief test pilot, a man also named Geoffrey de Havilland. There were some minor initial criticisms of the flight performance, but it was otherwise a pretty satisfactory flight. More rigorous testing was completed during 1944, with constant minor upgrades made to the aircraft to try to solve some of the criticisms the test pilots were giving. One of the more common initial complaints was the all-round view of the cockpit, especially when the pilot tried to look behind. Other aspects of the aircraft highlighted during testing were the low climb rate, recommendations for dive brakes, and a common problem with early jet aircraft: low acceleration. One of the more difficult problems to solve was something that was referred to as snaking. This involved the aircraft shaking side to side, which is obviously not ideal when you're trying to hone in on a moving target with your guns. Tests were done with a large fin mounted on the front of the aircraft to try to see why this was happening, and it was eventually concluded that decreasing the size of the fins and rudders would help reduce the snaking to what is referred to as acceptable proportions. Around the same time, the plane was given the name Vampire. De Havilland was still committed to the production of the Mosquito, so production of the Vampire was instead subcontracted to English Electric, who had recently had an order for their single-seater fighter plane cancelled. An updated version of Halford's engine, which by now had been named Goblin, was to be fitted on Vampires past the first 40 produced, which would also be eventually refitted with this new Goblin 2 engine. The first of these production Vampires produced by English Electric flew on the 20th of April 1945, and shortly after began its service trials. Whilst the snaking was still present, it had been reduced by the modifications made during testing, and the Vampire was constantly praised with how pleasant it was to fly. It did not enter operational service before the end of the war, however, leaving the Gloucester Meteor as the only Allied jet aircraft to see combat during the war. Towards the end of 1945, it became clear that the RAF needed to choose a primary jet fighter, either the Vampire or the Meteor. The aircraft both competed in comparison trials, and in the report that followed, it was the Meteor that was favoured. Despite being less manoeuvrable than the Vampire, and with a shorter overall range, the Meteor was a more stable gun platform, had a higher rate of climb, and was faster. The report expressed doubt that the Vampire would be capable of intercepting jet-powered bombers due to its inferior speed. The Meteor was also considered a safer aircraft due to the twin-engine design. The Vampire would still have a place as a short-range, low-altitude fighter, but the Meteor was to be prioritised. In March 1946, the first service Vampires were delivered to No. 247 Squadron. These 8 aircraft replaced the Hawker Tempests that the squadron had been equipped with before. Soon, the Vampire was being given to squadrons all over the country, and even some squadrons outside the country, like those stationed in occupied Germany. In the period between the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, British squadrons in Germany under the title British Air Forces of Occupation, or BAFO, were equipped with aircraft that were rapidly becoming more and more obsolete. Tempests, Mosquitoes and Spitfires were stationed in Germany, and despite these aircraft being some of the most impressive of the Second World War, they were, quite simply, not jet aircraft. From June 1948 to May 1949, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, forcing the Western powers to deliver all vital supplies to over 2 million people solely by air. Much to the shock of the Soviet Union, they succeeded, but the crisis had reinforced the need for a capable fighting force on the continent. BAFO Vampire squadrons took part in many varied training exercises, like interception and ground attack, and also headline roles in RAF displays in Germany. At home in Britain, RAF Fighter Command was no longer trying to fight off the threat of German bombers, manned or unmanned, over the skies. Much of the RAF's fighter planes were now on the continent, and economic turmoil after the war meant less money being put into fighter defence at home. Gloucester Meteors had become the organisation's first fighter jets in 1944, and just after the war, de Havilland's piston-engined Hornet fighters gave Fighter Command an advanced aircraft with a hell of a lot more range than the new jets. It's worth noting that the pilots being trained on the new jet fighters didn't have any trainer aircraft to begin with, so their first flights in the Vampires would have to be solo flights. Naturally, intense preparation was done for this role, including studying texts on jets and the aircraft, reportedly intense lectures on both the engine and the airframe, and even a Q&A session with Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. Again, one of the biggest differences that they were warned about was the slow acceleration of the jet engine, especially at low speeds, meaning that they operated on a much tighter margin of error for not only takeoff, but landing as well. But some refused to be curtailed by such a limitation. In December of 1945, Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown, as he was then, had successfully demonstrated a critical use for the Vampire. He landed the third Vampire prototype on an aircraft carrier. The role of jet aircraft on aircraft carriers had been debated because of their slower acceleration. If the aircraft were coming in too slow, there may not be as much time to react, as the engine would take longer to thrust up and speed up the aircraft to a more acceptable speed. This led many to oppose its use as a carrier-based aircraft, but nonetheless, 30 Sea Vampires were ordered by the Navy, although this was shortly reduced to just 18 aircraft. Not only was its limited acceleration a problem, early jets still had a range problem, even with the Vampire's advantage over the Meteor, making them less useful for operations off an aircraft carrier. But a record is a record, and the Vampire was the first jet fighter to be landed and taken off from an aircraft carrier. Not content with just the one record, the Vampire sought to break another. The Vampire was used as a pretty good testbed for an improved version of the Goblin engine, which would be called the Ghost. Previously, the testbed for the Ghost had been a modified civilian-use Lancaster bomber, known as the Lancastrian. 2 of the Merlin engines had been removed and replaced with jet engines. The Vampire was able to fly higher and faster than the Lancastrian Ghost testbed, making it a much better option for testing the new engine closer to, and at, its limits. They used the aircraft TG-278, which they modified to reach the highest altitudes they could. The cockpit was pressurized and heated, eventually being fitted with a metal hood with little porthole windows. 4 small scoops around the engine were added to give it extra cooling, and the engine exhaust was extended, along with, naturally, the wingtips. With all this new modification on a cutting-edge testing aircraft, the team at de Havilland decided they would go for the world record, which was still held by an Italian biplane that reached 56,046 feet 10 years earlier in 1938. On the 23rd of March 1948, John Cunningham flew the TG-278 Vampire up to 59,446 feet, taking the world record for the de Havilland Vampire until it was broken by the Canberra 5 years later. We've talked about the acceleration issues a lot, but as far as the RAF was concerned, the Meteor and Vampire's limited range was what truly held it back as an operational aircraft. That's where the Vampire F Mark III came in. The first Vampires could only be up and about for 30 to 40 minutes or so, severely limiting its operational capability. As early as 1945, de Havilland started working on a Vampire that could stay up in the air for a lot longer. More fuel tanks were added inside the aircraft, and already existing fuel tanks were increased in capacity. A few other structural changes were made as well. You can see the difference between the first Vampires and the F Mark III by the vertical tail fins, which were more rounded for structural and aerodynamic reasons. These new tail surfaces brought them more in line with some of the previous aircraft de Havilland had made, from the Mosquito all the way back to the Moth biplanes. Early tests of the Vampire F Mark III showed that the aircraft's handling wasn't great, and especially poor at higher altitudes, where it would behave oversensitively to control inputs. Despite these flaws, it was decided that the production of the new Mark should go ahead, with pilots being warned about its poor handling characteristics. The RAF was particularly keen to get their hands on longer-range jets. Now with a much greater range, potentially being able to stay in the air for hours, the RAF wanted to push the boundaries of where jets could operate. In 1947, they began to start working to see how the Vampire would fare in warmer climates. During these trials, it faced a rather surprising enemy: pirates. During somewhat of a world tour for a Vampire F Mark III, it was at one stage forced to land on a strip of sand in the South China Sea. This area was rife with pirate activity, and the pilot feared he could be attacked by the Chinese pirates lurking in the nearby waters to try to get their hands on the rather valuable prize of the Vampire. Luckily, thanks to the cooperation of various official services in the area, a Sunderland flying boat on patrol was able to provide assistance while a nearby light cruiser, HMS Belfast, came to the rescue. The Vampire F Mark III had achieved its primary goal. Now, especially when fitted with drop tanks, it had a range much greater than the first Vampires. In 1948, rumours of the US Air Force attempting to cross the Atlantic for the first time with a jet aircraft gave the RAF an excuse to show off the new range of the Vampire F Mark III. The range difference wasn't going to allow it to travel the entire colossal distance between Britain and the Americas. Even the most modern jet fighters would need to be escorted by refueling tankers in order to make the trip. The Vampires would have to stop off at Iceland and Greenland before making their way to their destination in Canada. So, in July 1948, 6 Vampires left Odium in the UK. After being delayed by bad weather, they arrived 2 weeks later in Goose Bay, Canada, for a series of air displays across Canada and the USA. Alongside these displays, the squadron also flew practice interceptions against American F-51 pistoned engines and F-80 jet fighters. This was seen as somewhat of a revival of the idea of a goodwill visit. These would continue with other nations as well, with one rather charming exchange in 1950 where a visiting squadron of Swedish Vampires enjoyed the RAF's hospitality so much they insisted on a return visit the following year. So, in August of 1951, No. 72 Squadron of the RAF flew to various bases around Sweden and were treated to a similarly impressive welcome, which at one point even included a cruise. After it was decided that the Gloucester Meteor would be Britain's primary jet fighter, de Havilland realised that the Vampire was actually quite well suited for another role it could adopt. Having been originally conceived as a high-altitude fighter, it had very low wing loading to ensure it could still manoeuvre effectively at these altitudes. This in turn meant that it was capable of a very high load carrying capacity, seemingly making it an excellent choice for a ground attack fighter. It would have to be modified to optimize its use at low altitude and to make sure it could mount bombs or rockets on its wings, but it seemed like an obvious calling for the Vampire. The undercarriage and wings would both be strengthened to make sure it could handle what would be a heavier aircraft with all ordnance attached. The wings would also be shortened slightly, and the wingtips would be squared off, instead of the more rounded wingtips seen on earlier marks. This would improve manoeuvrability at lower altitudes, and was something that we saw happen to low-altitude Spitfires in our Spitfire documentary all those years ago. The rest of the airframe was generally strengthened, and armour was added around the bottom, with the view to protect the engine from shrapnel coming from the bombs that the variant had dropped. It was originally proposed that this variant would have an ejection seat, but this was eventually removed from the specification. The variant was designated as the Vampire FB5, and it was the most numerously produced Vampire variant, with over 1,000 being made. The Vampire model you've been seeing flying around is an FB5 from the video game War Thunder. The first FB5s were delivered to the RAF at the end of 1948, but by this time, the Vampire was starting to show its age. I'm not going to go into detail about all the other Vampire marks, as this isn't a full documentary, but I will do a quick overview. The Vampire FB9 was essentially a tropical variant of the FB5. The cockpit could get scorching hot in warmer climates, with pilots often complaining about heat and some even suffering from heat exhaustion whilst operating the aircraft. It took a while for a cockpit air conditioning system to be made that could condition the pilot, but eventually the FB9 was made with a Godfrey blower air conditioning system in the right wing root. A two-seater trainer version was also made, and it was very popular. The trainer was called the T11, with the Sea Vampire version being designated T22. These trainers were very successful, being envisioned as an intermediate trainer and often praised for its performance in the role. Hundreds of T11 trainers were produced, and they were sold to a variety of air forces around the world, including the Swiss, Indian, and Australian air forces. That brings us to the Vampire NF-10, the Vampire's night fighter variant. Towards the end of the 40s and into the early 50s, rising tensions in the Middle East saw the UK government impose an embargo on arms sales and deliveries to Egypt, meaning the Vampire NF-10s that had been built for the Egyptian Air Force could not be delivered. Instead, they were delivered to the RAF to act as an interim between the Mosquito night fighters and the Meteor and Venom night fighter jets. A night fighter is, as you'd probably expect, a fighter designed to fight in the darkness of nighttime. By this time, the main difference between night fighters and day fighters was the internal radar that night fighters carried, usually mounted in the nose, giving them a bulky front appearance. They also required a second seat, like the trainers, to allow for a dedicated radar operator. The radar that the Vampire NF-10 used was an AI Mark 10, the same used in the Mosquito night fighter variants. Deliveries of the NF-10 would arrive at the RAF in April of 1951, but it would, in many ways, ring the final bell for the de Havilland Vampire. While very manoeuvrable and capable of catching Avro Lincoln and Boeing B-29 heavy bombers powered by propellers, it very much struggled to intercept jet bombers like the English Electric Canberra that was also introduced in 1951. Such was the power difference between the two aircraft, there is even a story of a Vampire NF-10 being overtaken by a Canberra that had its air brakes extended. Before I round off the Vampire story, there are a couple of other things I want to talk about first. First is the DH-108. The DH-108 was built to test the behaviour of a swept wing design, and was basically a tailless Vampire with swept wings. It was first flown in May 1946, with test pilot Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. praising its handling qualities, particularly at low speeds. Its development was seen as a testbed for the proposed four-engined DH-106 aircraft, a much larger plane that could deliver mail quickly over long distances. This too was envisioned to be a tailless swept-wing aircraft, although during testing of the DH-108 it was decided that the DH-106 aircraft should have a tail. Testing continued on the DH-108 as it was seen as an important testbed for high-speed flight research, with its top speed Mach number approaching 1.0, the speed of sound. On the 27th of September 1946, Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. took the DH-108 for a flight that would simulate conditions for a world record attempt to certify it as ready for the feat. About half an hour later, reports of an explosion and a crash into the Thames estuary were reported. Geoffrey de Havilland's body was found 10 days later. The DH-108 continued with 2 more prototypes, becoming the first British aircraft to break the sound barrier and take off and land under its own power. The 3rd prototype crashed in February of 1950, killing the pilot Stuart Muller-Rowland, and the 2nd crashed in May in the same year, killing its pilot George Genders. The DH-106 mail transport aircraft would eventually become the de Havilland Comet, the world's first passenger jet airliner. Data gathered from the DH-108 was surely very valuable to the Comet and the later Sea Vixen swept-wing carrier-based fighter. We haven't really talked much about the Vampire's operational combat history, and that's because there's very little of it. Vampire FB5s were involved in ground strikes during the Malayan emergency in 1951, replacing Spitfire Mark 18s of No. 60 Squadron. Probably the biggest thing we haven't mentioned so far is its service with other countries other than the UK, and that's certainly not because it's a short list. 30 countries around the world ordered or acquired Vampires, although not quite all of these received any. The Vampire saw some more combat in the service of other air forces. For example, Egyptian Vampires, which had been acquired through other countries outside of the UK, came into conflict with Israeli Meteors in 1955. On one occasion, 2 Meteors intercepted 4 Vampires. The Vampires did not fire back at the Meteors, instead escaping through the clouds. 1 may have been lost during this encounter, but we don't know for sure. The Vampires in the Indian Air Force participated in ground attack missions during the Indo-Pakistan conflict in 1965. During this conflict, Vampires were intercepted by F-86 Sabres, a swept-wing aircraft that came into service years after the Vampire and completely outclassed it. Vampire T-11 trainers were particularly popular with foreign buyers. In fact, the Swiss Air Force continued to operate Vampire trainers until 1990, when they were replaced by BAE Hawks. That's an incredible service lifespan. I couldn't really talk about the Vampire without at least mentioning the Venom, which, to be fair, I already have, but I will explain what it was. In 1948, after the success of the high-altitude testing of the Ghost engine that saw the Vampire break the world altitude record, de Havilland started to work on a new Vampire type powered by the new engine. It came with a host of design changes, including a thinner wing and, most obviously to the external observer, external fuel tanks were mounted at the end of the wings. The Mark was considered too different from the Vampire airframe, necessitating the need to designate a completely new aircraft type. It was called the Valkyrie, and seemed like a promising interim between the first generation of British fighters and the ones that would follow, like the Hawker Hunter. A few months after Valkyrie was chosen, the name was changed to Venom. The Venom's introduction into the RAF was not smooth sailing. Engine fires, structural problems, and more meant that many squadrons actually reverted back to Vampires as these issues were being fixed. But fixed they were, and the Venom flew with the RAF until 1962, seeing combat in the Malayan Emergency, Aden Emergency, and the Suez Crisis. While it was a lot more capable than the Vampire, it was only ever really designed to fill the gap between the Vampires and Meteors and the Hunters and Sea Vixens. While the strength of RAF Fighter Command saw a resurgence at the end of the 40s, it was becoming clear that the Vampire was falling behind. Jet aircraft technology had advanced rapidly, and while the latest versions of the Meteor could still just about keep up, the Vampire was just too slow. By the early 50s, the Vampire was one of the most outdated planes in the RAF. In 1949, the MiG-15 was introduced into service for the Soviet Union. The Vampire, and even the Meteor, were no match. NATO had advanced their jet technologies as well. The Venom had provided a suitable upgrade, and the American F-86 Sabre was more of a match with the MiG-15. With the Hawker Hunter around the corner and eventually in service in 1954, the Vampire was left in the dust. It remained in service with the Royal Auxiliary Air Force until the massive defence cuts that followed the Suez Crisis of 1956. Having not been the first and coming into service during a time of relative peace and lightning-fast technological development in the aeronautical world, the Vampire was, perhaps, always fated to lack a particularly noteworthy service history. And yet, not only did it become a record-breaking aircraft, it was sought after around the world as the international community stepped into the jet age. So many nations chose the Vampire as their first, and Vampires were being sold to new operators even after the RAF considered it obsolete. On the 13th of June 1990, a small ceremony was held in Switzerland to mark the official withdrawal of the Vampire from service. Among those present were many former Vampire pilots, including John Cunningham, the man who had taken the high-altitude modified Vampire to over 59,000 feet in 1948, his little wooden jet plane carrying him higher than any human had ever been. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please do leave a like, as I'm told it does wonders for helping the video get recommended to more people. I tried a few extra things to make it more interesting, so let me know in the comments what you did or didn't like, and I'll try and incorporate that into future content. Hopefully you didn't notice anything wrong with the music, because that's all done by me in this video, and I've expanded away from just the piano as well. I've made a selection of what I wrote as a video on the second channel, so check that out in the pinned comment and description if you like. As always, feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content from us. If you're interested in weekly updates in the world's science news, check out the 7 Days of Science YouTube channel for exactly that. In the next video, we're heading down to Cornwall with a special guest to take a look at the ruins of a fascinating castle with a strange connection to the legends of King Arthur.